Once again, you're welcome to Waidsum Academy. Today, we'll be looking at the topic in biology called variation. We're doing biology, and our topic for today is variation. Now, before we move further, let's take this tutorial and understand the concept, the ordinary meaning of variation.
This video is about variation in living organisms. Dogs can have long legs or short legs, floppy ears or upright ears, or short faces or long faces. Variation can be continuous or discontinuous. Continuous variation gives a range of phenotypes or observable traits that fall on a quantitative scale, for example height in trees or body mass in cattle. Discontinuous variation gives phenotypes that fall into distinct groups, such as ABO blood groups in humans or body colour in moths. Variation can be caused by genetic factors and by factors in the environment. Continuous variation, for example, a person's height or body mass, will be determined by a combination of their genes and factors in the environment. Discontinuous variation, for example, an individual's blood type, usually results from the effect of genetic factors alone. Variation can be investigated by measuring the frequency of traits, that is, the number of individuals with different characteristics in a population. For example, to investigate continuous variation, you could survey the heights of students in your science class. The results can then be plotted on a histogram where the bars touch and the categories on the x-axis group numbers into ranges. To investigate discontinuous variation, you could survey tongue rolling ability in your class. Students can either roll their tongue or they can't. The frequency of discontinuous traits can be plotted as a bar chart where separate bars represent each category. In this exam question, we're given a graph that shows the blood groups of some patients sampled in a hospital and asked to explain how the graph shows that blood group is an example of discontinuous variation and to describe the variation in blood groups in the sample shown in the graph. In part A, we need to look at the features of the graph. It has separate bars used to represent discontinuous data, so we can answer the question by stating that there are gaps between the bars, or by identifying the graph as a bar chart rather than a histogram. In part B, we need to describe the data. Describe questions do not require prior knowledge, so avoid explaining and instead say what you see. For example, that blood group O is the most common, and that blood group AB is the least common. You should then back up any statements using numbers from the graph. For example, 50 patients have blood group O, and 5 patients have blood group AB. Another description could state that 4 times more patients, 40, have blood group A, and blood group B, which has 10. It is always a good idea to use numbers when describing data. In summary, variation can be defined as differences between individuals of a species. Continuous variation is caused by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Discontinuous variation is caused by genetic factors alone. It is possible to investigate variation and record the findings in a histogram or bar graph. Don't forget to check out all our other fantastic resources here.
Okay, so we've listened to the tutorial. So the summary of this variation has been given. Variation has been summarized. So the only thing we need to just highlight here is to, first of all, elaborate on the definition a bit, the types of variation, the type of uh, phenotypic variation, the type, the categories. Okay, so we've seen that the variation can be defined as the differences that exist in individuals of the same species. In the tutorial, the example that was given was a dog. Dog with a big ear, dog with a tall this, dog with hairy body, dog with this, dog with that. So you can see the different variation of in the organisms of the same species, looking at dog as the species in this case. So we see the ones that are tall, the ones that are fatty, the ones that are hairy, the ones that have lobes, and so on and so forth. So the differences that exist in the organisms of the same species is what we call variation. From the word varies, okay, something varies means not exactly the same thing. So it's the difference that you can find in organisms or individuals of the same species. If you compare it with organisms of other species, then it's no longer a fair ground comparison. So we will not call it variation. We only call it variation when we can find the differences in organisms of the same species. For example, in human beings, we have tall people, we have very fatty people, obese people, we have very chubby people, colored people, white people, red people, these all kinds of these things. All these are you're looking at the same species. So if you're looking at the same species and you're finding the differences that exist in this same species, this is variation. You're looking at people who can roll their tongue and people cannot roll their tongue. You see people with different blood group A, group B, group C. These are variation. Despite they are organisms of the same species, despite they are organisms of the same species, but they, despite they are organisms of the same species, but they what? They exhibit different characteristics. They exhibit different characteristics. So since they exhibit different characteristics, we call this variation. We call this variation. Okay. So that's what that part is. Now, variations can be defined or can be divided into or can be described in two types. Okay, can be described in two types. One is called genetic variation, and the other one is when we're looking at phenotypic variation, we say we can specialize or we can categorize it to two types. Or the differences that exist in the organisms of the same species can be influenced or affected by two factors. Let's put it as a factor. The differences that exist in organisms of the same species can be affected by two factors, the genetic and the environment. The genetic and the environment. Now, the types of variation, the phenotypic variation can be divided into two types. One is continuous variation and the other one is discontinuous variation. Continuous variations are those variations or differences in characteristics that can be quantifiable, that can be measurable, okay, that can be seen on a continuous difference basis, okay. So we say continuous variation is when very many small degree of difference exist between the organisms. Maybe the heights of people in a class, same class, usually almost same age mate, almost. Okay, so you can find the height variables differences very insignificant. Okay, so this is a continuous variation. The weight, how you weigh on a scale, the weight of people in the same class, or so on and so forth. So these are examples of continuous variation, something that's continuously measurable. Okay, so are examples of your finger length, your mass, your weight, your height, your all of these things. These are continuous variation. These are called continuous variation. They can be represented by a continuous straight line. They can be shown with a continuous straight line. Okay, for example of continuous variation, we can just use a discrete line to show it. Okay. Okay, so now let's that's for continuous variation. What about discontinuous variation? A discontinuous variation is when there's a distinct or discrete step. Okay, when there's discrete step differences for the characteristics. For example, in the case of this is a histogram. In the case of a bar chart, there are gaps between the plots. Okay, for histogram easily represent a continuous variation. This is a continuous. So for a continuous variation, you can draw for a continuous variation. You can simply draw. You can simply draw. Okay, for a continuous variation, we can simply represent that graph, the histogram with a curve graph, something like this. You can simply represent this is a continuous variation. Okay? If you join all the histogram in a curve path or a line graph, you get something like this. This is a continuous variation because each of the bar were joined together. The bars were joined together. If you make all the bar, you start having something like this. For example, they're joined together, so you can make a continuous variation from here. This is a bar, so we can make a line graph. So when you have a line graph, we can call this a continuous variation. Now, what about discontinuous variation? These are characteristics that are discrete, okay? They are discrete. Characteristics that are discrete, okay, are called discontinuous variation. They are called discontinuous variation. For this type of variation is called continuous. So you find this a lot in the exam. You find continuous variation a lot in the exam. Okay? So, for example, this type of plotting is a continuous variation. Is a continuous variation. Whether it's in histograph form or it's a curve graph, then it's a continuous variation. But what about the discontinuous variation, which are in discrete step? Okay, this is for continuous. This is for continuous. A good example of continuous variation shouldn't be confused in the exam hall is the height of students in a class, the weight, the finger length, continuous. Okay, this continuous variation. This is for continuous variation. So a type of variation that is showing information in a continuous form manner is called a continuous variation. A good example is the one we've seen, the height of students. So you plot the height of students in a class or the weight of students. You plot the height of students in the class. The height of students. Or you put the height here and put the number of students here. Here we can put number here. So when you plot in a graph, you get what we call continuous variation, number of students. Okay, so that's that for that. Now let's move on to the second one, which is the discontinuous variation. Discontinuous variations are the differences that exist in the organisms in a stepwise manner, in a discrete form. A good example are blood group. So a blood group is an example of discontinuous variation. Blood group is an example of a discontinuous variation. So when we go to discontinuous, a very good example of discontinuous variation is the blood group. Discontinuous. So even if we are organisms of the same species, for example, we take human being as an example, we have different blood groups. Even if we have the same father, same mother, we have different blood groups. We have blood group A. We have people with blood group A. We have blood group AB. We have blood group B. We have blood group AB. We have blood group AB, and we have blood group O. We have AB, and then we have blood group O. So even if you are organisms of the same species, you have discrete measurable variation that exists amongst us, even if we are organisms of the same species. So, and these ones, discontinuous variation, they are usually caused by only genetic factor. They are usually caused by only genetic factor, meaning your gene, your DNA. Okay, they are not caused by environmental factor. But continuous variation, this is also an exam question. Okay, continuous variations are caused by, these ones are caused by both the genetic factor and the environmental factor. Because, for example, your height, the height of students are affected by the gene that they inherit from their parents. So if your parents have a gene for tallness, the child will also have it, but it will be affected whether by another factor apart from the gene you inherit from your parent and also the environment, whether the child was poorly brought up with no food or the child had enough adequate nutrients while he was growing up. So if you have adequate nutrients while you were growing up, and your father also have the necessary, your father and mother, that's your parents, also have the necessary gene for tallness or for height, then the offspring or the child will definitely be tall. So what we are saying here is that continuous variation is affected by the two factors, both the genetic factor and the environmental factor. So it's not enough for your father or your mother or for your parents to have the DNA for for being tall. It's not just enough for the children to be automatically tall. The environment matters, the food they eat. So when we talk about the environment in this regard, we talk about the food, whether they have poor meal or they eat good meal, whether they have poor meal or they eat good meal. So if you're eating good meal and you already have the gene for tallness, then the child will be very tall. So continuous variations such as height, weight, weight, length of fingers, how long your fingers are. These are continuous variations which are affected by these two factors, both the genetic factor and the environmental factor. Now, for discontinuous variation, they are only affected by genetic factor. They are only affected by, there is no environmental factor in this regard. The genetic variation are only affected by the environmental, by the genetic, sorry, the discontinuous variation are only affected by the genetic factor, because your blood group type, if there's nothing about environment in your blood group type. Okay, so whether you are in blood group A, your blood group B is only a DNA setting. It's only a DNA setting that determines whether you are in blood group A, blood group B, blood group AB, and blood group O. Another types of characteristics for discontinuous variation. Remember, we said discontinuous is when there is discrete step. When there is discrete step. So I'm going to show that using a bar chart. I'm going to show that using a bar chart. When there is discrete step in the characteristics of organisms that fall under this. So another thing is the ability, rolling of tongue. Okay, whether you can be of the same parent, some of the children can roll their tongue, some cannot. Okay, rolling of the tongue, able to roll your tongue, or you are not able to roll your tongue. So it's an example of discontinuous variation. Rolling of tongue, rolling of the tongue. So let's take a look at that, rolling of the tongue. If we can do that, it's not caused by environment. Okay, this variation type or these factors that affect this ability to roll your tongue is not caused by the environment. It's only caused by the genetic factor, your DNA. It's caused by your DNA. It's not caused by. So again, we say we have to show this one graphically to show a discontinuous variation. These are always in the exam, either in multiple choice or in theoretical form. And if you can harvest this and put it in the bank, it helps you a lot in your success rate. So topics like this, you pay very good attention. So here for this, we say we show a bar chart, not a histogram this time around. We show a bar chart for a discontinuous. So there are gaps. There are gaps in a continuous variation. There are gaps between the bars. There are gaps in a discontinuous variation. There are gaps between the bars. This is a discontinuous. There is discrete steps. There's what we call discrete step. It has a discrete step between them. Okay, there are gaps between the bar. So if you have a plot like this, okay, it's called a discontinuous variation. Okay, you cannot draw a curve for this type of thing. You don't, because they don't join together. So it's not continuous. It's discrete. It's discrete. There are gaps between the bar. It's discrete. So this type of variation is called a, see, it's discrete. There are gaps, stepwise gaps that exist between bar. So this type of variation, like blood group, okay, like rolling of tongue and so on and so forth, all these are called discontinuous variation. They are called discontinuous variation, and they're only caused by a genetic factor, not a combination of both. They only can be caused by a genetic factor. Okay, let's see if we have more examples that we can highlight here. Whether you're a male or female, okay, it's a male or female. It's also a type of it's also, whether you're a male or female, whether you're a male or female is also a type of whether you're a male or female is also a type of discontinuous variation. Another example is gender. Okay, gender. This is being a male or female. So I will just use the word gender. Being a male or female is not determined by environmental factor. It's only your DNA. It's only the gene. Okay, it's only the gene that determines that whether you're so you can see the environment has no role to play in a child being a male or being a female. So these type of these things they are called discontinuous variation. They're very the gap between them is wide. The gap between the like being a male or being a female is completely steply distinct, completely distinct. In a continuous, the gap are not distinct. They are not distinct. Okay, they are close. They are not distinct. But in discontinuous variation, the gap are. For example, this is a graph for discontinuous. You can see this is a bar chart. This is a graph for discontinuous. So you can plot it for each of the block group A, block group B, A, B, and block group O. Okay. Now we've already mentioned this. We say phenotypic variations they're caused by two factors: the genetic and the environment. I've explained that concept. Now, genetic variation examples of genetic variations in human include what? The blood group. Examples. I think we mentioned them. The gender, the eye color also. Okay, we can include the eye color. Okay, eye color. Number 4. The color of the eye that you have is a discontinuous variation. It's not caused by environmental factor. It's not caused by the environmental factor. It's not caused by the food you eat. It's not caused by the place you grew up in, the language you speak. Okay, eye color. But how you speak, your accent, is a continuous variation. That one is caused by the environment you grew up in. The language you speak and the accent you use is a continuous variation. So we can include that here. Okay, other continuous. Examples of continuous, we say height. Other continuous variation, we say the height of pupils in class, the weight, the mass. All these are continuous variation. The language you speak, height, weight, for continuous variation. Weight, weight is very related to mass. So when I say weight, is mass multiplied by gravity. So when I say weight, you already know that you have a chance of measuring mass. So number 3, we can say the mass. Okay, the mass of the people is an example of continuous variation. Okay, the language you speak. The language you speak is affected by two factors: the environment and the genetic. Okay, the language and the asset. These are usually environmental. They are usually environmental, right? Language and accent are usually environmental. So environmental factor. They are not affected. They are not so because they are environmental. They fall under the accent. They fall under the category of continuous variation. But for discontinuous variation, your eye color, rolling of tongue, gender, blood group, and so on and so forth. All of these, they are discontinuous variation. Ability to roll tongue, whether earlobe or no earlobe. Some people they have earlobe, some don't have earlobe. Okay, some people so is lobeless. We say lobeless. You have your ear are lobeless ear, and then we have lobed ear. Okay, we have lobed ear, we have lobeless. Okay, the lobed ear is the one that is curved here at the bottom, and then the lobeless one is one that is flat here at the bottom, like a curve, just one curve. So if you have one curve, just one straight curve coming like this, then we say your ear is lobeless. Your ear is lobeless. But if your ear gallops and curved here very deeply, in the end, we say it's lobed. So this lobe and lobeless ear is a factor caused by genetic, the gene, and which makes it a discontinuous variation. Now let's go to environmental variation. The environments are, already indirectly we've explained this. Kinds of species can be affected by the environment they live in, right? Like What are the environmental factors that can affect an organism? The climate, the diet, the accident, culture, lifestyle. So these are common factors or common contributors of environmental factors. So when we say the environmental factors, that can easily change our dynamics, how we look, height we have, everything. It's usually all of some of this. Not only limited to this, but these are very common characteristics that are environmentally providential. So let's take a look at these environmental factors, common environmental factors that shape our continuous variation. Common environmental factors that can shape our continuous variation. Okay? Common environmental factors that can shape our continuous variation. Number one is climate. Number one is climate. You know, every day we hear about climate change. You hear the polar ice, the ice will soon melt, and all those countries will become the world may be flooded, and so on and so forth. You have the winter region countries. You have the very hot countries. You have different climates in different weather, and so on and so forth. So climate is an environmental factor that determines our continuous variation, that affect our continuous variation. So if you're in a tall country, very hot country, your characteristics is different from someone. Sometimes even your color is maybe affected, and many things about you may be affected compared to someone in a very cold climate. So another thing is that is coming from the environment. This is your diet, your culture, accident, lifestyle. Okay, we say accident. Let's mention accident. Accident can put a scar in your body. Okay, a scar that didn't come with you at birth can be in your body as a result of accident. So accident is an environmental factor that that contribute to the continuous variation. Accident is an environmental factor that can contribute to the continuous variation. And another factor is the diet, the food you eat. Are they balanced diet, or are you eating? Are you from a very poor country where there is no food? Okay, and mind you, there are poor countries in all of the continents. So when we say poor country, you shouldn't think it's one continent. We have very poor countries in even very advanced continents. We have very, very poor countries in those continents. Okay, so are you from a poor country or poor environment or poor state or poor family where you don't find a balanced diet to eat on daily basis? If you don't find balanced diet, you don't eat proteins, you don't eat fibers, that's the vegetables. You don't take vegetables. You know, fibers they help in digestion. They help in digestion. Fibers. They are called roughages. They are called roughages. Roughages or fibers, which are the vitamins, the leaves, the green leaf vegetables. Okay, they help in digestion. They aid. They stop constipations. So when you eat this type of food, and they also contribute to your antibodies and antigens that helps your white blood cells to fight against diseases and pathogens in your body. So when you're eating good, you have proteins which enhances your enzymic reactions and the productions of your growth, your new cells. And every time cells die in our body, and we need protein to replenish them or to replace them when cells die in our body. So when you eat good food, good protein, food with protein, carbohydrate, fats, vitamins, iron, and so on and so forth. When your foods are balanced, your diets are balanced, so your growth will not be distorted. Your growth will not be affected by the environment you're living in. Okay, so diet is a very big factors, environmental factor that contribute to your continuous variation. Another factor is your lifestyle. This one is very important. You know, if you eat a lot, if you are someone who eats a lot without having an active lifestyle, active life, then you gain a lot of weight. You become obese. You become obese. Lifestyle. So if you are the type, maybe you are from a good country, you have a lot of food, or good environment, you have a lot of food, you're eating a lot, but you don't have active life, and you're not very busy. You don't do a lot of exercises to keep fit and build yourself. Despite you eat a lot to burn the food, to reduce the calories in your body, then you might become obese. You might be faced with other health challenges like diabetes and so on and so on, and cholesterol and so on and so forth. So lifestyle is a big environmental factor that contributes to our continuous variation. Is that okay? So let's take a look at another factor. There's still some out there. We measure accident, right? Environmental factor. Then the culture of a people. Okay, culture. You know, there are some culture that affect your. For example, there are people always dancing, cultural music, dancing, singing, dancing. These ones contribute to building, burning the food that you eat and give you a proper shape and proper good head balance. So the culture plays a lot of role in as a factor that affect the continuous variation. Okay, that affect your continuous variation, your weight. If you affect your mass, sometimes the culture will affect your mass, your weight, your height, and so on and so forth. The culture contributes. Okay, the culture of a people. There are more of the cultural values. Okay, I just use the dancing collodron to cite this instance. Okay, now let's move on. So we've talked about the 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 environmental factor. What about the genetic factor? The big genetic factor is about the DNA, the genes and the alleles. Okay, so the genetic factors in the DNA and alleles. Now the variations that is being affected by genetic factor and environmental factors are called the discontinuous variation. They are called the continuous variation. The one that is affected by both are called the continuous variation. Is that okay? They are called the continuous variation. For example, if you are given birth to, for continuous variation, we say you need both the genetic and the environment factors. For example, if you are given birth to by tall parents, they will pass the gene of tallness to their children, right? For their children to be tall. But that's not enough. If there are no good food, you don't have good diet, you eat poor diet, the children may not be as tall as they're supposed to be, even though they have the gene for tallness. So you can see the poor diet is coming from the environment, while the gene of tallness is coming from the genetic factors. So this is how continuous variation is being affected by two things. Now let's go to the part B of our today's work, which is called mutation. Now let's listen to this tutorial before we.
This video is on mutations. Mutations are genetic changes. These changes can lead to the formation of new alleles. For example, an allele that codes for altered body colour in moths. The genetic changes in mutations are alterations to the DNA base sequence. For example, a base or group of bases may be swapped for another base, or bases may be added or removed. Because mutations generate new base sequences, they are an important source of genetic variation, along with meiosis, random mating in a population, and random fertilization of gametes. Remember that mutations are random changes to the DNA base sequence. While mutations occur randomly all the time, when cells make new copies of their DNA, the rate at which they occur can be affected by factors in the environment. For example, mutation rate increases in response to ionizing radiation, such as X-rays or ultraviolet rays, which enter the nucleus and damage the DNA. Chemical mutagens, such as the chemicals found in cigarette smoke, can also increase mutation rate. This exam question gives a graph that shows how the number of mutations increases as the dose of UV radiation increases, then asks us to define the term mutation and to describe and explain the results shown in the graph. The term mutation can be defined as genetic changes. Students studying extended content should be able to give a more detailed definition than this, and should state that mutations are random changes to the DNA base sequence. Part B asks us to both describe and explain the results in the graph. Describe questions relating to data require a say what you see approach. Here there is only one mark available for describing. So we can simply say that as UV dose increases, so does the number of mutations. We then need to explain why this is the case. You should know that ionizing radiation, of which UV is an example, increases the rate at which mutations occur. You should avoid stating that ionic radiation causes mutations, as mutations occur even in the absence of radiation. You should instead say that it increases the rate of mutation. In summary, mutations are genetic changes. Mutations can give rise to new alleles. Ionizing radiation and chemical mutagens can increase mutation rate. Extended students should also know that mutations are random changes to the DNA base sequence, and that mutations are a source of genetic variation, along with meiosis, random mating, and random fertilization. Don't forget to check out all our other fantastic...
Okay, so we've heard the tutorial explaining mutations as genetic changes. And then for extended students, you should go beyond that to say that it's changes that affect the base sequence of the DNA, right? So mutations have, most mutations, they have no effect on the phenotype as the protein that are being mutated or the protein that a mutated gene produces may work just as well as the protein with non-mutated gene. Okay, so most of them, but some of them is different. The case is different. Okay, mutation sometimes or rarely mutation leads to the development of new alleles. Okay, in mutation, new alleles are formed. Okay, new alleles are formed. So new phenotype, and if they do, most of the small effect on the organisms will be very obvious. Okay, now we say the new alleles gives the individual a survival advantage, because if you have new allele, you have a different, a sole characteristics that may be different from before, which one of them could be a survival advantage over the members of the species, because you are now different. You have a new alleles. It's the alteration to your cell DNA, the alteration, the changes that occur to your DNA base sequence. Okay, the changes that occur to your DNA base sequence. And this is random. It happens all the time. And we'll talk about the factors that affect mutation. It happens all the time, and every now and then. One of it is that affects it is the ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is one of the factors that affects us. Another factor that affects mutation is the chemical mutagens, like the tar in the tobacco cigarette. When you smoke cigarette, the tar in it is actually gradually affecting your DNA base sequence, and this will make you mutant. Okay, will make you mutant. You see that you'll be gradually drying up or different from the rest of the children in the family if you're the other one that smoke, and so on over time. So mutation is gradually happening to you. You're being mutated. Your DNA base sequence is being mutated without you knowing it. So a bird develops a mutation leading to change in feather colors. Okay, your mutation can lead to change in the feather color for a bird. It can lead to your lip. Your lip, the color of your lip will become black or become brown or become something else. It can affect other characteristics. Okay. Okay, so for the case of the bird that has changes its color, you see that such a bird will be now more attractive to other birds of opposite sex, right? These birds will now be more attractive because the bird has been mutated, the feather color has been mutated, and these have made this bird to be more attractive, and there will be more mating and more fertilization taking place as a result of mutation. So we can say, as a result of this, we can boldly say that mutation leads to more random mating, more random fertilization, okay, and more random attraction, and so on and so forth. So mutation can lead to harmful changes also. It can lead to harmful changes, not only positive change. It can lead to harmful changes that have a dramatic effect on the organisms, that will have a very severe effect on the organisms. a good example, it can lead to sickle cell anemia in humans. It can lead to sickle cell anemias in humans. So you can get yourself mutated to an extent, to a degree that you become a sickle cell anemia. You start having a sickle cell anemia. You know, sickle cell anemia is a topic for another thing. It's a big problem, right? SS. You now have SS in your phenotypic rearrangement. You now have a sickle cell anemia. Okay? Mutation, this type of mutation, we say they are harmful. They are harmful. So we be careful the way we consume chemicals such as chemical mutagens like tar in the cigarette, in tobacco cigarette, okay? That so as not to harm us in such a bad way that we start having what we call the sickle cell. Mutation happens very randomly and very spontaneously and continuously. But their frequency can be increased by what? These factors that we mentioned. They happens to every human being, every living organism. Mutations happen to all organisms, but probably in a slow manner or probably in a very small, tiny amount. But the rate of increase of mutation, the rate of mutation can happen, meaning we can have more mutation based on the following factor. Okay, based on the following factor. One is the ionizing radiation. One is ionizing radiation. One is ionizing radiation mutation. Okay, or let's say mutation rate. Mutation rate, factors that affect or that increase the mutation in organism. One is ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation. Okay, so radiation that enters into our body, they affect the change in the base sequence of our cell DNA. They affect the base sequence of our cell DNA. So hence, they cause mutation to happen to organisms. Okay, number two is chemical mutagen. This chemical mutagen is not only limited to cigarette. Okay, other chemicals taken in that are dangerous, that can change our formation, cause changes to happen to our DNA, also fall under this chemical mutagen. But while we gave this example, this is very common among young people smoking cigarette. Young people smoking cigarette. So you are actually gathering chemical substances that will change your DNA, that will mutate you to something different from what you used to be. Okay, ionizing radiation is one, like gamma ray and X-ray. Okay, they can cause damage bond and causes changes in the base sequence of organisms. Some non-ionizing radiation like the UV. Okay, apart from ionizing radiation, we have non-ionizing radiation like the UV light, ultraviolet light, UV light. Okay, can also damage the bonds that cause some chemical changes. And there's certain types of chemical. We've already mentioned the chemical, only that we need to put non-ionizing radiation. So we have three factors that cause mutants to happen to our DNA, that cause mutation to happen to our DNA. Ionizing radiation, non-ionizing radiation, and chemical mutagens. Non-ionizing radiation. The non-ionizing radiation, a good example is non-ionizing. A good example is UV light. Non-ionizing radiation. So a good example is UV light. So each of them will give an example that increases the rate of mutation in our body. That increases the rate of mutation in our body. So this one we say UV light, ultraviolet light from the sun. The UV light from the sun. Okay, it's a non-ionizing radiation, but it causes mutations to happen to organisms, cause the DNA to change, the DNA base sequence of organisms to change. Then here we can say tobacco, tar in tobacco. Tar, there's nicotine, there's tar. Okay, tar in tobacco causes mutation to happen to our DNA. Tar in tobacco. So for those who take tobacco, or who smoke cigarette, then uh, they actually contributed to the, the changes that is happening to their body. Okay, we say mutations sometimes have a little bit of advantage, but most times they have a very damaging effect. Ionizing, ionizing example, we say for ionizing, we say the X-ray and gamma rays. The X-ray, we say the X-rays and the gamma ray. So you can find this, okay, in exam and gamma ray. So we should have this idea very well and be able to answer exam questions on mutation and variation. Is that okay? Should be able to answer exam questions on mutation and variation. Okay, so that's that for that. The factors, the three factors that affect the rate of mutation. Okay, okay. So it's the same when you say for extended. It's everything that we have highlighted. Uh, Almost everything that we have highlighted, except that we need to take summary of this one. It's a summary of sources of the genetic variation in population. One is mutation. Mutation causes variation a lot. Okay, mutation is a factor that's actually causing variation because it's actually something that is affecting your DNA, changing your DNA to something different. Okay, so because it leads to the formation of new alleles, okay, through a random changes to the DNA. So new alleles are formed. Since new alleles are formed, then the characteristics of the person will begin to be different. Another factor that increases or that causes variation is the meiosis. Okay, in meiosis, new alleles combine to new alleles combination form through segregation because the division is taking place and new ones are formed through division. So since new alleles are formed through cell division, then we say this is a factor that is causing variation. So one external factor that is causing, apart from the one we mentioned about the environment and the gene, one is mutation, meiosis, random mating, which partnership for sexual reproduction. Okay, random mating also causes variation to happen a lot, and random fertilization also cause variation to happen a lot. So with this, we've come to the end of our class. Thank you for joining our today's class.